Hello and welcome to another standard video. Today we're revisiting the black-green self-mill archetype, and a version very similar to this also made the top 8 of the latest standard Pro Tour, so it definitely seems like a powerful archetype nowadays, and the deck picked up a lot of new additions in Aetherdrift. At 1 mana we now have Molt Tender as a creature that can tap to mill a card, filling the graveyard to discount a lot of our spells, and then can also exile a card from our graveyard to add 1 mana of any color, so that can also come in handy, often exiling lands or some of our non-creature cards, since we want to keep as many creatures in the graveyard as possible. Then at 2 mana, we now also get to play with Quack Feast as a removal spell that will mill 2 cards in the process, destroying an opposing creature, planeswalker, or even vehicle with mana value less than or equal to the number of cards in our graveyard. So if we cast it on turn 2, it can easily take out a 1 or 2 drop, but as we keep filling the graveyard, it can also scale as the game progresses, and filling the graveyard is very important, again, to enable the rest of our deck. Then we also have the new Gravestalker as one of our curve toppers, a 6 mana 5/4, but it gets a 1 mana discount for each artifact and or creature card in our graveyard. So the goal is to get at least 5 creatures in the graveyard, so we can cast this for just a single black, and then a 5/4 for 1 mana is a pretty good deal, especially considering it will also draw a card if we control up the Beanstalk. So this is the main reason we want to dip into green, so we get to draw a card when it enters, and whenever we cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater. Then besides the Gravestalker, there's the Hollow Marauder, which is even more expensive, but this gets us a 4/2 flyer that also makes the opponent discard a card when it enters, and potentially drawing us an extra card in the process. And then the Husk Burster Swarm is even more expensive, but then we get a 6/6 with Menace and Death Touch, and this also gets a discount from cards that are in exile, so that can also be useful if our opponent is playing some Graveyard Hate, for instance. We might still be able to play the Swarm on the cheap and draw us more cards with our Beanstalk. Then Harvester of Misery, also a 5-drop we could cast to wipe the board of all small creatures, but we can also discard it for 1 and a black to give a creature -2/-2 until end of turn, so it can be another early removal spell if needed against aggro. And then Overlord is probably the most powerful card in this deck to not only enable our synergies, like filling the graveyard with additional creatures, but even if we impend it for 1 and a black, it will still draw us a card off up the Beanstalk, so that's incredibly valuable. And then we can also return non-avatar creatures from the graveyard in addition to milling 4 cards, so hopefully we mill as many creatures as possible. Can always decline to get a creature back if we just want to keep the creature count in the graveyard as high as possible. And then another card to trigger up the Beanstalk is the Overwhelming Remorse, also gets a discount for each creature card in our graveyard, so it can also reduce it down to just a single black to exile target creature or planeswalker. And then rounding out the deck, there's the Gnawing Vermin, which can mill 2 cards when it enters and gives a creature -1/-1 when it dies, so that can also help fill the graveyard for us, and we can maybe sacrifice it to a turn 2 Souls of the Lost. As an additional cost, we have to either discard a card or sacrifice a permanent, and then it grows with the number of permanents in our graveyard, so not only tracks creatures, but also lands and enchantments, for instance, so it can get quite large, but is also just a good enabler early. If we have a handful of these expensive creatures, we usually don't mind discarding 1 to then discount the rest while getting a Souls of the Lost in play. And then, of course, the Gravestalker can also be cycled for 2 mana, so if we have too many of those stuck in hand, we can at least discard them and draw, while filling the graveyard with an extra creature. And then the mana base also now gets to play with a new black-green Verge land, very important actually, can help us cast our Molt Tender and Beanstalk early, and then in the late game, once we can cast all of these spells for a single black, we basically want every land to produce black mana, which is why we only have the 1 forest, and then the Verge should also be able to tap for black at some point, once we find one of our basics, or the Mortuary can also help enable it. This enters tapped, but also lets us surveil 1, and then Llanowar Wastes don't want to play too many, since it will end up costing us a lot of life, but Blooming Marsh is also perfect, since we only have 20 lands total, relatively low land count, but that's also because assuming we fill the graveyard, our curve is also relatively low. Now I did experiment with a blue version of this deck as well, very similar to the previous iteration where we played Glarb as one of our card draw engines, and then you could or could not include up the Beanstalk, that's kind of up to you. But the addition of blue also gives you access to a kicked Lurgoyf, which can potentially mill 6 cards if you play all the kicker costs. And then there's also the Somnophage, which you can also adventure, milling additional cards. So there are potentially blue versions of this deck as well that you could try, but the mana base, of course, is going to be much more consistent in just black-green. So yeah, that's our deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Okay, we're on the play. We have what looks like a keeper. Turn 1 Mold Tender. Got removal with Quack Feast, 2 ways to fill the graveyard with Overlord. And can always cycle the Gravestalker. Our mana's good. Facing red aggro. Alright, Heartfire Hero, probably worth taking out already. Although we could wait in case a scarier creature shows up. And then for now, mill with Overlord. Could also mill with Mold Tender first to improve my odds of actually having a creature to return. Although if I mill another 1-mana creature, I might actually play it here. And yeah, there it is, Gnawing Vermin. Exile a land to cast it. Or I guess Quack Feast makes more sense, since that's not a permanent for Souls of the Lost. And then Vermin can mill 2. Milling 2 creatures. So we currently have just a 2 in graveyard. And yeah, opponent does have the dream start of Heartfire into Manifold. So now blocking with Vermin wouldn't be able to finish off Heartfire Hero if we give it -1. Opponent actually declines to attack. So we can potentially Quack Feast both of their creatures. Probably worth it before this picks up more counters. But I'm most likely taking out both. Can play a 2-mana Gravestalker. But I think just going for double Gravestalker next turn is fine. And then hope to draw up the Beanstalk beforehand. This one probably still hangs back in case they play a hasty Emberheart Challenger, for instance. Screaming Nemesis, that one hurts. Don't necessarily want to chump that one, although I would only take 1 damage. But we can already play Gravestalkers for 1 mana. How many creatures total do we have? 3, 4, 5... So if I were to draw Swarm or another Marauder, it could maybe benefit me to chump. And yeah, since we're not gaining any life here, I guess that's reasonable. They could take out Mold Tender, but then that will discount our stuff even more. And now we can play 1-mana Swarm. So yeah, we're just gonna go for it. And now if they attack, we can just take 3. And Swarm they won't be able to block with a single Nemesis. Hoping to draw more removal spells. Opponent sends in both creatures, interesting. So I guess Monstrous Rage gets Swift Spear up to 5. So that I could still block with a Swarm. So they might have 2 burn spells. But this seems relatively safe. I guess I could have a Witchstalker Frenzy dealing 5, and then trade for Swift Spear. But it also seems reasonable. I don't think I want to block Nemesis now, because then we make it easier for them to trade for our stuff. So I think we'll start here. They're just going to Monstrous Rage the Nemesis. So they've maybe given up on answering the Swarm. Still gotta watch out for Witchstalker Frenzy dealing 5 to their own Nemesis as well. And draw Surveil Land. So if I attack with everyone, they could still Frenzy a Gravestalker, take 11, which still seems reasonable. Keeping a Gravestalker back means they can trade for both, which seems pretty weak. And at 12, I think I'm safe to just try and outrace our opponent. Even if they answer a Gravestalker here, we still have their life total at least. And now any one of our creatures can be lethal. So we'll see. Remorse on top is a perfect answer to the Screaming Nemesis. I would draw off Beanstalk as well. So can our opponent deal 12? It's gonna be difficult. Challenger into another Monstrous Rage, still doesn't quite do it. And just a shock. Alright, GG's. So they got close, but not close enough. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the play. We have a one-lander, although our one land does let us surveil. And then with a second land, we're kind of off to the races. So, sketchy, but I'm willing to try it. And then we can still play the Vermin at the very least. And beautiful swamp on top. Opponent on a more controlling red-green deck, maybe? For now, could Beanstalk, and then if I Imp and Overlord we get to draw. Makes it more likely that we draw more lanes. Opponent still not playing anything. Okay, I'll start with maybe the Vermin. Even though it's possible I would mill Molt Tender, which could be a slightly better play here. But if we play Vermin first, then I make it more likely that I will at least get a creature back. Milled 2 lanes. And get to draw. Find another Swarm, so now we just want to mill as many creatures as possible. And we milled 2. Yeah, Vermin I can still take, since I expect to mill more with it. And then Harvester I can also use to take out my own creature if I really need to. Opponent still being patient. Found another Overlord, so I guess we'll start there. Might draw into a land of Beanstalk. Found a Molt Tender instead. And yeah, there's still only 2 creatures in Graveyard. One's an Avatar that I cannot select. Do we even want to grab the Gravestalker? I can cycle it, so maybe that's still worth it. Definitely a close call. Could see the advantage of leaving it in the graveyard. Yeah, I'll actually decline here. And then hit you for 1. The fact that our opponent's being pretty passive makes me think they might be on a combo deck playing the Smuggler Surprise, for instance, in red-green. And that deck could win out of nowhere, so we're not going to get many chances to cast a Quack Feast beforehand. Molt Tender can just make a mana. Could be convinced to use Quack Feast on my own creatures as well. But we'll start with Vermin. Mill for 2. Mill the creature this time. Alright, so what if I Quack Feast the Vermin? Sure, let's try it. Wouldn't be able to take out my other Vermin with a -1 since it's only opposing creatures. But yeah, now we can play 1 mana Marauder. This can exile a non-permanent card, which would be Quack Feast. Trigger Beanstalk as well. And we'll maybe get a bit more info on what the opponent's trying to do. And now Huskburster looks a lot more castable. So Smuggler Surprise can win the game on 6 mana. And that's probably where we're headed. Alright, so can Overlord again. Draw Beanstalk. And then likely play 1 mana Swarms. Don't think there's any sweepers we need to worry about, although a Remorse being instant speed removal could actually save us. And let's see, we have 6, 7, 8. So if I get 1 creature back, I can still play these for 1 mana. And what makes the most sense? Maybe the Souls of the Lost or just another Swarm. Is there any 6 damage effects? I don't think so. So play Swarm. Draw a card. Okay, so another one. Exiling, I guess there's no instants and sorceries left, so land now. And then we can keep up Remorse without relying on the Molt Tender. Yeah, I don't think I can risk it, even though we haven't played land for a turn yet. We are threatening lethal next turn, and with Remorse I can maybe stop a combo from killing me. So, does our opponent have the Smuggler Surprise? Shocked Pikachu. And yeah, Galta plus Voltborn. So I might want to Remorse the Tyrant now, before they get more value. And then exiling it means they don't get the artifact token. But they now could still have more combo pieces in hand, of course. And yep, that looks pretty deadly, although Calamity I guess doesn't have anything to just straight up win the game. But Itali's still pretty gross here. Trailblazer draws a million cards. And then Calamity can, I guess, not make a copy of a Legend. Still good with a Trailblazer. And our opponent just wants to draw more cards. Alright, so I get to block Calamity, take 12. And then with double Quack Feast, can we clear a path? Might be able to. Can start by taking out Itali. And then, yeah, we have more than enough cards in graveyard to even take out Galta. Alright. And then now I can attack for 16 on the ground, so we're a little bit short. So now I might just want to Harvester the Trailblazer. And then hit for 16. And hope they don't have lethal on the way back. Still pretty sketchy, but let's try it. Get rid of Quack Feast. Keeping Vermin back doesn't help against a Swarm. Are there any other haste creatures we're worried about? Yeah, I guess Calamity still kind of kills us. But it's pretty rough to keep enough blockers back. So I'm just gonna go for it and hope for the best. Opponent falls to 2. And I guess we do get an Overlord, so maybe keeping Vermin back was still worth it. Brotherhood's End is fine. Do they have another one? And a Braid. That's acceptable. And a Hydra. So that's not good enough. Opponent passes, and now another Quack Feast should get the job done. But I kind of want to see what we draw first. Keep the suspense for our opponent, since they've been such a great sport. Alright. And attack. And we've got a lot of options on what to get back. Yeah, still very close game. And we definitely got hit by a pretty nasty surprise. And I think our opponents may have disconnected here. Yeah, there's not too many cards left in our library. Just the 6 cards. So we've seen most of our deck. And yeah, the overwhelming Remorse was pretty key. Otherwise our opponent would have gained even more life and drawn even more cards. But yeah, pretty happy with Quack Feast as a removal spell. That can also enable your synergies pretty early on in the game. Because if you keep a hand with too many copies of Overwhelming Remorse without early enablers, you might just die to an aggro deck before you get a chance to cast it. At least Quack Feast can be cast early in the game, even though it doesn't have the same synergy with Up the Beanstalk, and being a sorcery, of course, is a bit weaker than being an instant. Exiling creatures can also have its advantages, but I think a mix of both seems decent. And that'll do it. Sweet. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the play. We've got a keepable hand, a little bit light on early enablers to fill the graveyard, but souls can discard a creature if needed. And then for the grindy matchups, we've got Up the Beanstalk. Opponent's green-white. Yeah, I'll play as souls, I think. Or we can take a more patient approach, Beanstalk first, and then wait and see what our opponent does. Mold Tender's a good one. If they play a creature, we could Quack Feast it. Opponent names Avatar, so it might be the Overlord Domain deck, which will have a powerful late game. But with Beanstalk we also have one. So Mold Tender plus Souls. Yeah, if they play a lockdown, at least the Swarm will get a bit of a discount. But that's maybe a reason to hang on to Souls of the Lost for an extra turn. Play the Mortuary, and then Overlord's perfect. Can play it alongside Souls of the Lost. Opponent just cycling Herd Migrations to fix their mana. Cavern names Avatars, so they may not be on a Zur Eternal Schemer build, since that requires blue and black as well. But yeah, for now, Imp and Overlord. Likely gonna mill with a Mold Tender. And get another one back. Or we could leave it there, but I don't mind just playing it here. And then I could still cast the Souls of the Lost by exiling a land. Or I guess a Quack Feast makes more sense since it's not a permanent. And then I think discard. Yeah, it's a close call. Can always exile the land next turn to make a mana without affecting the cost of these. Now we are pretty vulnerable to a temporary lockdown. But I could still cast a Swarm, I suppose. Alright, we get to untap. So step one, I think mill with Mold Tender. That's not a creature. So now I'm actually unable to cast a Marauder, since it kind of relied on both Mold Tenders making mana. So I guess we'll just keep milling then. Try and grow Souls of the Lost. Hit for 4. That connects. I don't really want to Quack Feast my own stuff, so we'll pass. Opponent cycles another Herd Migration. Could see a Sunfall here at 5 mana, exiling our team. They're maybe instead looking at a Get Lost, yep. And then maybe setting up their lockdown to exile everything. Nope, Sunfall instead. Alright, so we can cast Swarm for 2 mana. Draw a card. And once again, I think I prefer that over exploring, although if we explore our lands, it's likely an untapped land, which can still cast a Swarm. If it's a creature, then milling it enables a 1 mana Swarm. So that works out. Alright. My other creatures are still on the pricey side. But as soon as our opponent plays a creature, we can Quack Feast it. So for now, hit you for 12. Another Get Lost. That's alright. And a Leyline Binding. So then I can play another Swarm, start exploring. Gravestalker, probably fine to put in the graveyard, as the name implies. Can explore again. Moltender can go. Play this for 1 mana. Opponent will have to discard, and now with a second Marauder we can empty their hand. So then our opponent's going to have to top deck. And Archangel of Wrath, their last card. So I could still play Gravestalker. On the off chance that they top deck another Sunfall, I think I would rather set up this Beanstalk first, so we can draw more afterwards, since we already have a decent amount of pressure in play. Although I suppose with Gravestalker we would have threatened 22, but they could always block with Incubator, so we would have been a little bit short. So now can go ahead and attack. Opponent can't really block with Incubator since we have Menace. So there's no real reason to cast too much more stuff. Even though it is tempting to just jam a bunch more creatures. Yeah, I think I'll show some restraint. With 3 creatures, I think we've got most situations covered outside of a board wipe. And our opponent explodes, I'll take it. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the play with a fine hand. Vermin good alongside Souls of the Lost. Although for now we can Surveil. And don't think I need Forest. Want to look for some of our payoff cards that can draw off Beanstalk. And yeah, double Vermin seems okay. Facing red-white. Could be the Aura deck. Which does have some 1 toughness creatures, but they will likely be able to protect them if they're not running one out on turn 1. Still nothing, so it could also be the more controlling version. So hit you for 2, and yeah, could run out Souls of the Lost, sacking one of the Vermins. Cannot target my own creatures with a -1/-1, otherwise I could have set up a chain reaction here. And Blooming Marsh also doesn't seem super needed. Opponent still being patient. So I'm kind of expecting a board wipe. In which case, playing up the Beanstalk here is maybe not a bad idea. Still okay playing Vermin to grow Souls of the Lost before attacking. Okay, so that's nice and large. Hit you for 9, and then play Beanstalk, setting up our follow-up creatures. Okay, so if they wipe the board, I can pretty much empty out my hands. Alright, never mind, our opponent was an Aura deck after all, maybe just waiting to find a creature. And a Sheltered by Ghosts can answer my souls. That's alright. So we can kick things off with... Yeah, I guess I could consider attacking first as well. Because if they block, I can finish off the hero. And then maybe go with Swarm plus Marauder this turn. Or we can now double Gravestalker. That's why it's important that almost every lane produces black, since we have so many 1-mana spells to cast once our graveyard's full enough. Swarm still gets a discount from Souls in Exile. Okay, so double Gravestalker it is. They will be able to grow the Heartfire. So it's gonna turn into an interesting race. Ethereal Armor. Any of our removal spells can deal with the Heartfire hero at this point. Question is whether they can protect it. I guess the upside of playing Swarm is that it can attack past just a single hero. Although as soon as they play a second creature, they can still take it out with First Strike. So then it would not really be able to attack. But yeah, opponent's got a 10-powered creature here. And another Sheltered by Ghosts. Our opponent's going all in. So if we draw Quag Feast, I wouldn't be able to pay enough ward. If I draw my 5-mana removal spell, then I can pay 4-mana ward. It's going to be a Vermin as our top deck, so we can only hit back for 12. Well, I'll start with Swarm. See what we draw. Well, there's our Remorse. Although now I'm 1 mana short of paying the wards, and as soon as they untap, they might have a Shard Mage's Rescue up. So, not quite what we were hoping for. But, I guess I'll play Vermin into Marauder now. Quag Feast goes by. I'll draw another Swarm. Alright, so I probably just have to play defense. Currently with 13 power. Yeah, it's not like I have a great block, but they've discarded double Monstrous Rage, so they might have another one in hand to give Trample. So then I'll need as much toughness as possible. Feather Flight, so if they still have Trample, we're dead. Otherwise I can still chump with a Marauder. And yeah, looks like they have the Monstrous Rage number 3. No, they don't, so maybe their last card is a Shard Mage's Rescue. If not, Overwhelming Remorse can take care of it. Let's see here, I can still play Swarm, and then maybe we'll suss it out based on whether they hold priority or not. There was maybe a very slight delay, it's hard to tell. But I guess I'll go for it before they draw into a potential answer. I'm gotta pay the ward. Alright, that worked. Get our stuff back. And discard your last card, please. It was just a land. Okay, so we can attack. And next turn we should be able to close it out. But yeah, incredibly close game, despite our opponent not doing much in the first couple turns. And Manifold Mouse is not gonna get the job done. Sweet, on to the next one. Okay, we're on the play with a solid hand. Some early enablers to discount our other creatures. And I'll definitely keep Overlord, that's probably our best enabler. Opponent on a green-white deck with lots of 1-drops, probably playing the new Gearhulk. So could already play Souls of the Lost, probably hang on to Quag Feast for something scarier, or we could Harvester the Scout. Want to play Beanstalk before we impend the Overlord, so maybe next turn I'll play the Beanstalk, and then for now we'll just play defense. Inspector's fine. And another one. Okay, so play Beanstalk, might draw into a tapped land. and I'll happily play a 1-drop instead. The alternative would have been to play Souls first, since we already had 4 mana to then go Beanstalk into Overlord. But now if we find one of our Curve Toppers, we can maybe already play them at a discount. As we see a Swarm in the graveyard. 3 creatures total. Opponent might be playing Knight Errant that they can convoke here. Or a Duskrose Reliquary. Cannot get rid of enchantments, so just exiles or vermin. Exiling, of course, better than destroying in this matchup. Okay, so we'll start with Overlord. And then we might still be able to play a Swarm afterwards. So, could decline to get something back. Although Harvester's looking pretty good. That's something I can cast for 5 mana next turn potentially. And then here could go for a Souls of the Lost, or we could play another Overlord. This will draw me a card, so makes it more likely that I can cast Harvester next turn. And if they were willing to Reliquary on Vermin, they might have another copy in hand. So then it's maybe fine to be a little patient. And yeah, here could go for the Marauder, since the Swarm we already have in hand and is a little more expensive. Because I guess it does get a discount from the Vermin in Exile, which is different from the Marauder, so they actually cost the same here. Opponent does indeed have the Gearhulk, so we'll see what they get. Lantern, yeah, that's going to be a problem, and Haywire Might. So I need to cast my Graveyard Synergy cards while I can. Marauder, I guess, would also potentially make them discard one of those cards. So I can start here. Quack Feast, I guess, is also an option. Especially if it mills a creature, we get to take out the Gearhulk and still maybe cast some of these for 1 mana. Okay. So now I get to play Marauder, draw with Beanstalk, make the opponent discard, potentially draw again. Alright, so didn't draw the land for turn here. I guess there's still a shot, since we know we'll get to draw once again. Alright, but didn't get there. So we'll have to discard. Maybe get rid of a Molt Tender, which is going to be a little slow to get going. At least Vermin, milling for 2 right away, can help us fill the graveyard once again. But yeah, if we just draw land 5, cast a Harvester, we're pretty far ahead. So yeah, opponents searched up their Graveyard Hate, was able to cast it. I'll take 2. And Harvester's looking pretty good, although I guess it will destroy my own Marauders. So we'll want to attack for 8 first. Swarm is still 1 mana, since those cards in exile did not affect it. So we could also take a different approach here. And just play the Swarm, take it from there, as opposed to Harvester, wipe the board, which would then, I guess, discount my other spells as well. Yeah, Swarm counting stuff in exile does make a pretty big difference. And then can still play Souls, or maybe start with a Vermin. Could also sacrifice Vermin with my Souls of the Lost, although there's no 1 toughness creature to take out. But that's still reasonable. And play Molt Tender. And then we don't really have to cast a Harvester yet. And there's Warden, so that is a must answer. So Quack Feast should get the job done here, since it looks at mana value. And yeah, opponent scoops it up. Awesome. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the draw with a hand that's maybe a little light on enablers, but we also don't have the payoffs in hand yet. So for now we're just drawing some cards, answering a creature, and then hoping to draw some self-mill effects. I'll try it. Black-red. A very aggressive start could have been problematic, since we only have the one cheap removal spell. Souls of the Lost seems worth keeping, since it can always discard a creature. But for now I don't mind beanstalking it up. Wait for souls to be a little bit larger so it doesn't die to a burn spell. Opponent's not doing much, although could be a bad sign that they're maybe on a Reanimator deck, which will have a more powerful late game than us. For now, could beanstalk again. And then we might draw into a tapped land. Aha, Demonic Pact, that also makes sense. So yeah, just sitting here doing nothing isn't really gonna win us the game. So I probably need to play a Souls of the Lost, although it could just die to the 4 damage next turn. Quack Feast is probably not doing much for me either. Could technically target my own creature with it as well, just to mill 2. Yeah, I guess we'll play Souls, discarding Harvester. I can still at least discard at any point, if I can target a creature. Quack Feast, I need to target a creature right now. I don't think Remorse is going to find any targets. Yeah, the plan's probably just to cast Harvester for 5 next turn, since that'll draw off double Beanstalk. Another Demonic Pact. So they might already have a way to gift it in hand. Opponent can make us discard 4 cards at once. They're just gonna draw, take out Harvester, makes sense. Well, at this point we're just hoping they don't have Harmless Offering, because we're definitely not presenting lethal before that happens. Opponent passes once again. Can play Souls, discarding maybe another Souls, and then cast Marauder. Discard 2, and opponent draws 2, so we can discard a Molt Tender and probably a Quack Feast. And is there a Harmless Offering? There sure is. Alright, GG's. Nightmare makes me discard again, but the game is already over. Yeah, no disenchants in this build to take care of a Demonic Pact, unfortunately. So the only option is you lose the game. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the draw. Hand seems functional. Vermin into Beanstalk, can cycle maybe the first Gravestalker. And now Overlord's great too. Still tempted to Beanstalk first, so we get to draw off Impending. And we milled 1 creature. Opponent's also on a graveyard deck of sorts. Seed of Hope, get Mountain. Could be a Delirium deck. And there's a Fear of Missing Out, confirming our suspicion. Okay. Still gonna play the Beanstalk. Land is good. So next turn we can double spell Overlord plus Molt Tender at the very least. And Delirium has been achieved. So they can hit me twice already. Do they have the hasty Wicker Folk? ENT still pretty good. So they can give the Fear trample if they'd like. Discarding the Expert, so they might be able to get that back as well. Could still chump with the Vermin, just to discount our spells. Although next turn I should still be able to. I don't really see myself casting a Gravestalker next turn after Impending, but I guess it's not impossible. I'll wait one more turn. Does our opponent discard again? They can't really make use of the cards in exile right now, but maybe they value the additional damage. Discarded a Ren and a Realm Breaker. Take 4. Another Vermin's not bad either. Still probably going for Overlord, and then I guess another Vermin over Molt Tender now. Harvester could also be a decent answer, but I imagine ENT's gonna grow. And then I could of course decline to get anything back, just to keep the graveyard more full, which I think makes sense right now. Play Vermin, and then we can try to line up some blocks. If I double block ENT, I can give it -2/-2, so that can maybe still take it out after they put a +1 counter on it. Just a fear of missing out attacking. Could still double block and then take out ENT with the 2 triggers. Does mean I take a lot of damage, so if they have the double strike instant, we are certainly dead. But I guess that's gonna be the case no matter what. ENT down. And take 5 more. And the Paw Patch is next. Alright, so we're under a lot of pressure. Beastie as well. Can we stabilize? I guess we start by casting Gravestalker and then maybe Swarm. Mortuary I could cast, or I could still play Swarm, hope to draw an untapped black source, and then I can still play Gravestalker, or if I surveil a creature, I can play this for 1 and add Molt Tender to the board. What's more likely, untapped black source or creature, and which one's, I guess, more worth it? Definitely prefer playing an extra Gravestalker, but odds of untapped black are pretty low since Blooming Marsh enters tapped. We've already drawn a decent number of swamps. So I think I'm better off surveilling, hoping to hit a creature. Quack Feast. Quack Feast wouldn't be a bad top deck, and I guess it doesn't help with Swarm, so I guess we'll keep that on top. So we only have the 2 blockers, which may or may not be enough. Can at least block the fear of missing out with the Swarm now. Because yeah, if they attack all out, they could use the Fear's ability on, let's say, a Paw Patch recruit. But then I just block the Paw Patch and the Fear, so then they only get in for 4. If they target Beastie, we're definitely blocking that one. Torch a tower, that's fine. Still trades, and we're still alive. And we've got more goodies in hand. So not in a hurry to Quack Feast anything. Just want to put more bodies in play. I guess we're 1 mana short of casting Harvester, which would have been pretty decent too. So instead, how about... could impend another Overlord. I think I still start by casting a Gravestalker. See what we draw. Untap land. So now I could maybe afford to impend Overlord. Get back like a Marauder. And then play that plus another Gravestalker. But alright, our opponent scoops it up. We already have enough toughness here, so it's going to be hard for them to close out the game, especially considering their removal is a Torch a Tower and not a burn spell that can go upstairs. Sweet, on to the next one. Okay, we're on the play. We have Molt Tender to start out, but then it might take us a second to find a second land, and without it we can't do much. Although I suppose we can mill with Moltender and then make mana. Still a little bit sketchy, but it really only takes one land for this hand to work out. So I'm gonna keep, even though it's pretty risky. Facing red-green. Gnawing Vermin I can still cast. And then end of turn we'll mill with a Moltender. Did not mill any creatures. And Burst Lightning the Vermin, so they might have some 1-toughness creatures they want to protect. Otherwise Souls of the Lost sacking Vermin could have taken them out. But now Moltender can maybe still make mana for us. And then the question is, do we Beanstalk or get Souls of the Lost in play first? Ideally play Souls with more than 3 toughness, so it doesn't die to their cheaper burn spells. For now, Manifold Mouse, we can also Harvester before our opponent untaps with pump spells. So we'll mill. Hope to draw land. Did not. So do we try to draw land with Beanstalk anyways? Or is it just Harvester, exiling the Remorse, and take it from there? Yeah, at least we're still putting a creature in the graveyard here. Keep the land, since that's still a permanent for Souls of the Lost. And I could potentially risk it, and our opponent might play a pump spell on the Manifold Mouse. And then I can respond with my -2/2. If they have more than one pump spell, that's gonna be a blowout. So I'd rather play it safe. Opponent's got a bunch more creatures, still no land, but we're getting close to a 1-mana Gravestalker at least. So now what? All the cards in my graveyards are either lands or creatures. Lands less important, so that I could still maybe exile. And then Harvester the Manifolds. And then now the Souls is getting pretty large. Opponent finally dealt first blood. And they're going for a Monstrous Rage. Found our land. Okay, so cannot quite double spell here, unless, I guess, Souls could discard something. But then if I want to play 1-mana Gravestalker, I would have to exile a creature to make mana, so that's not going to work. So, yeah, maybe this is just a Souls of the Lost turn. Could even discard the Swarm. And then next turn, Beanstalk into Gravestalker is looking good. I suppose I could technically maybe cast a Gravestalker, since when we're casting it, it does have the discount, and then we exile the card in graveyard to pay for it. So I think that actually does work, but since we want to Beanstalk first, I'm gonna wait. And then we can just mill with a Moltender instead. Opponent going with a Questing Druid, found a Flyer, so that could be a concern. We need to find our Marauders. Challenger we should still be able to hold off. Right, opponent's jamming. So now it makes sense to block Hired Claw, because if they have another Monstrous Rage, Souls will survive, whereas if I block Challenger, it's a trade. Could also be a Witchstalker Frenzy, I suppose, which would take out our creature no matter what. Do still get to mill with Moltender, so I guess I could still grow the Souls up to 7 toughness. Alright, milled Remorse, which would have been a fine draw as well. Okay, time for Beanstalk. And then I kind of want to try casting the Gravestalker. So yeah, I think I do have the option of just exiling a creature here, which would not affect the discount, but we have another Gravestalker in hand, so there's no real reason to. And found a Marauder, so that can help against future slick shots although they didn't play the one last turn. Could attack for 5. I think I'll play it safe. Just keep more toughness back, since we suspect a monstrous rage. And then now, yeah, I guess I'll just double block. Opponent can have whichever creature they like. Overprotects. Alright, so indestructible as well. But shouldn't take any trample damage at least. Opponent's kinda limited in how much green mana they have. A Lightning Strike Souls, so they can actually take out both creatures. That was a nice play. But I think we'll be able to financially recover. So we can up the Beanstalk. Do these cost 1 even if I exile a creature. I guess I can still play a land as well. Play Marauder. Get your last card. And a Gravestalker. And our opponent has seen enough, can now start chaining together 1-mana creatures that draw me 2 cards plus, and that'll do it. So we got to see this latest iteration of the black-green self-mill deck in action, and I was quite pleased with all of the newcomers, especially Quack Feast being removal that can still help fill the graveyard for us. That kind of scales as the game progresses. But of course the risk of including too many non-creature spells is that we're gonna make those self-mill effects less effective at filling the graveyard with more creatures. So sometimes you'll keep a hand with what you think is enough enablers, but then you end up milling lands and maybe some instants and sorceries, and then your creatures still cost too much for you to deploy them in time, and you just get run over by aggro anyways. So there is still a little bit of variance involved with playing this archetype, but it's definitely a deck worth investing some time in, perfecting it, and also fine-tuning the list, since I'm sure there's still improvements that can be made. So yeah, that's going to do it for today's gameplay. Want to thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed, and as always, have a nice day.